So today we're going to talk about the kingdom fungi, and they are a really interesting set of organisms. They're not plants, and they're not animals, and they're not bacteria. They're their own classification. And one of the most famous type of fungi is a mushroom. So we're going to investigate how mushrooms actually create more mushrooms, how they reproduce, and learn a little bit more about this kind of misunderstood kingdom here. So the way we're going to explore this, we're going to do something that I like to call a spore design. Spores are how mushrooms reproduce and make more mushrooms. They're kind of like a seed, but since mushrooms are not plants, they're not green, they can't do any photosynthesis. They don't have seeds or cones like plants do. They have spores. And so looking at this mushroom, this is just, kind of regular little cap mushrooms you can get from the grocery store. Sometimes they're white, sometimes they're brown. Sometimes they're a lot bigger than these, like a portobello mushroom. So where do you think, okay, kind of looking at them, maybe you've never really looked at a mushroom this close before eating it. Maybe it's been cooked before you eat it. Where do you think the spores are? Okay, so some of the kind of interesting things about mushrooms, they do have parts with names. So this is the cap, and this is the stem, and this would normally be a lot longer, and it would go into the ground. And the part we never get to see is actually a really cool part of a mushroom. It's called mycelium, and it looks kind of like spaghetti. It's like this tangle, and it's in the ground, so we don't get to see it, and it actually does a really amazing thing. Fungus are decomposers. So if you know some examples of decomposers, they are a really important part of our food webs because they help recycle nutrients in things that have died recently. So we need to recycle all of those nutrients back into the ground so they can be reused for new living things. And fungus, like these mushrooms, are one of the organisms that helps us recycle nutrients back into the ground to be reused. So mycelium are those, it's like a long spaghetti-like structure underneath the ground, and they can go really far out, and you would never know. They are actually absorbing the nutrients in the ground from those dead, decomposing organisms, and they also absorb water. So very similar to a plant root, but it also absorbs those nutrients from dead things that are decomposing. So very important with our food webs. So we're going to explore a little thing, like I said, that I like to call spore designs. So the spores are actually, you can't see them because this cap is completely closed by a membrane, but the spores are inside. Okay, so we're going to do an activity to actually see what the spores look like. And if you're in the classroom, you can take this one step further after you get the spores out and look at them under the microscope to see what those structures look like up close. So a little bit of setup for this. One, we need to remove the stem. We also need to remove this membrane all around the mushroom. So it kind of works best if you just kind of pop it out. Okay, it'll pop out. You want to make sure you use mushrooms that still have that membrane all the way around, because then you know that all the spores are still in the mushroom. So I'm starting to see some dark brown. Those are the gills. That's where our spores are going to be found. So you are going to need an adult for this. If you are younger, if you're older and you followed all your safety rules and guidelines in your classroom, you may be able to do this yourself, but for younger kids, definitely want to get a grown-up's help. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually cut off the bottom of our cap here so we can see all of the gills. So I'm going to just put my knife really flat. You can also use like a flat razor blade or a scalpel if you're in the classroom. And you want to cut all the way around to expose all of these gills. So I'm going to hold this up for you. And I have my two questions that I always like asking. What do you notice and what do you wonder? So all of those lines are what is known as a gill. And inside those gills are the spores that we're trying to find. Okay, so we need a little bit of time for this. We have to be a little bit patient. So once I cut off the bottom of the cap, I'm gonna put my mushroom. This is a very important step. Sometimes my students forget this step and they do it a little bit backwards. The cap needs to go like this so that my gills are facing down. Because if they're facing up like this, nothing's gonna be able to fall out. Okay, so very important that it goes face down like that. So you can do this with different types of mushrooms, different sized mushrooms. Like I said, it just works best if you get ones that still have that membrane all the way closed up. So sometimes in the grocery store, if you get the loose mushrooms that are just sitting in a bin, those work the best. The ones that are prepackaged sometimes don't have that membrane left on them because they're a little bit older. Okay, so again, just cut the bottom of the cap off and place it face down. Putting it on a piece of paper works great because then you get a nice white background. So these three right here, I did yesterday. So they've had about a day to sit. And so I want you to make a prediction. What do you think, my first question, what do you think the color of the spores are? And B, what do you think the design of them looks like? And by design, I just mean they're gonna fall straight out of the gill. So what do you think that's gonna look like when they fall down? They're gonna make a design on my paper. All right, so hopefully you've had a second to think about those. And I'm gonna show you my spore designs. Okay, so I'm gonna pop these up. You see they still look normal. There's still gills in there. They're still brown. I'm going to move these that we just set on there. But when I lift it up, you can see, there's a little bit of moisture on the paper. So that's a really interesting observation. There's still water and moisture. And this evaporates out of the plant in a number of different ways. So some of it came out as some moisture. And we've got different designs. They are brown. And if you look up close, you don't see like individual dots. Maybe you thought you would see individual dots. There could be billions of spores inside each mushroom. So they're so tiny, our eyes are not able to see each individual spore. And that's why a microscope might be a really helpful tool to do an extension activity. This one made some nice lines. Sometimes they come out a little bit blurry, and sometimes you get really nice lines. So the spores are what creates new mushrooms. And so what happens when the spores fall out naturally, if it's still growing in the ground, the spores fall out and maybe the wind or if there's moisture or water in the ground will carry the spores kind of away a little bit. And they'll germinate. That's our term for kind of making a brand new, maybe it's a plant or a fungus. It'll start growing a little baby organism. And so the spores are what creates new mushrooms. Those fall out and fall down somewhere else. And if the environment is good, meaning there's water and there's those nutrients we said, because they are decomposers, they don't have mouths to eat any food and they don't have chloroplasts to do photosynthesis like a plant. So they have to find their food in the ground. So if there's food in the ground, nutrients for them to absorb, and there's water, then new little baby mushrooms can start growing. And so that's why when you see mushrooms growing naturally, maybe in some grass or out in the forest somewhere, they grow in little clusters. Those are probably all from the same family of mushrooms where the spores fell down and started growing a new little mushroom. And believe it or not, they're probably all connected underground by that mycelium, those root-like structures that are absorbing water, absorbing nutrients to keep the fungus alive. So that's something really cool about these mushrooms, which are part of the Kingdom Fungi. And they do get kind of a bad name. Sometimes we have kind of a reaction like, oh, because fungus, sometimes we think, oh, they always make you sick, or they're gross, or they're mold. But in reality, there's some really cool types of fungus. And a lot of people find them really tasty as well. So now you know some cool fun facts about Kingdom Fungi, and you have a way, this could even turn into an art project if you get really creative with where you're putting your caps down. But now you have a way to teach others about mushrooms and the Kingdom Fungi and show them how they create new mushrooms.